Grief counselor Jill Cohen reveals that the phrase, "don't make any big decisions for the first year after a loved one dies," is not a myth. It's a rule. But what if your job is to make the hardest decisions imaginable? The ones that affect the entire free world? After 5 consecutive hard-fought years on the campaign trail, Andrew Jackson had finally achieved the presidency. Old Hickory had proven he could endure what many historians call the most brutal campaign onslaught of the era. But a campaign doesn't just involve the public-facing candidate. Loved ones often get drawn into the fray, or sometimes caught in the crossfire. For Jackson, that person was Rachel Donaldson Jackson, his wife. While her husband's enemies had plenty of tabloid fodder to choose from, one theme kept emerging: salacious details about their marriage. The first episode in this series explored the abusive relationship between Rachel and her first husband. Andrew, acting as her self-appointed protector, went with her when she fled her home. The two eventually married under the mistaken belief that Rachel's prior husband had completed the divorce paperwork. A year later, after correcting the error, their wedding became legally legitimate. After 40 years of wedded bliss, the flaws in their origin story were laid bare to the voting public. Historian Anne Toplovich looks at the situation through Rachel's eyes, noting that she had little choice but to court Andrew to escape the daily onslaught of abuse. The historian explains, women did not have recourse to the divorce process as a means of recovering honor. If her petition failed, a woman's husband would still control her life because of coverture. A wife had no legal entity separate from her husband, and if she won, a woman's character suffered damage. Marriage to a man to whom she had been linked before the divorce was seen as a confession of illicit sexual relations. Today we might shrug and say all's well that ends well. I'm glad she found her way to a better situation. Or even, why does it matter as long as they're consenting adults? But in 1828, Rachel was labeled a homewrecker, an adulteress, and a bigamist. When word arrived that her husband had won the presidency, Rachel quietly responded, "Well, I'm glad for Mr. Jackson's sake, but as for me, I never wanted it." The vicious campaign had taken its toll, not just on Jackson's reputation, but on Rachel's body and spirit. She collapsed in its aftermath, worn down by months of brutal attacks and the looming burden of public life. She died just days later from a violent heart attack after enduring excruciating pain. Everyone grieves differently. For Andrew Jackson, Rachel was not just his wife, she was his anchor. As historian John Meacham writes, Rachel gave him what no one else ever had. In her arms and in their home, he found a steady sense of family, a sustaining universe, a place of peace in a world of war. Her love for him was unconditional. She cared for him not because he was a general or a president. She cared for him because he was Andrew Jackson. "Do not, my beloved husband, let the love of country, fame, and honor make you forget that you have me," she wrote to him during the War of 1812. "Without you, I would think them all empty shadows." Now Andrew Jackson was entering the political arena, surrounded by enemies who were already plotting vengeance against a man they had prejudged as a tyrant. And he did so without his anchor. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Episode number 6, A Government at War with Itself. Although she had passed before Andrew Jackson was officially sworn in as president, Rachel remains listed as a First Lady of the United States. The magnolia tree planted in her honor stood on the White House grounds for 200 years. In 2025, however, President Trump's administration replaced it with a 12-year-old sapling cultivated off-site from the original tree. Publicly, Jackson trusted that God had a plan. On January 18, 1829, he left the Hermitage for an inauguration scheduled for early March. He brought with him his niece, whom he entrusted to handle the largely ceremonial duties of the First Lady. The Capitol was eagerly awaiting his arrival, with Senator Daniel Webster telling confidants, "When he comes, he will bring a breeze with him. Which way it will blow, I cannot tell." Despite early claims that President Jackson intended to rule like a king, he slipped into Washington City without raising any fuss, fueling rumors that it had been him and not Rachel who had passed away suddenly. He spent his final days as president-elect assembling his cabinet. In 1829, that lineup included positions for state, war, treasury, navy, attorney general, and postmaster general. The two who proved most consequential were his trusted friend John Eaton and his former rival, the rising New Yorker Martin Van Buren. Eaton took the post of Secretary of War, while Van Buren assumed the mantle of Secretary of State. Not leading an army this time, Andrew Jackson arrived in Washington on a mission. At times, his ego led him to conflate the nation's problems, casting himself as the lone hero battling a host of enemies intent on destroying the common man. He had run in 1824 on a platform of anti-corruption. His prior experience in Congress and the 4 years of the Adams administration had only convinced him that Washington had become a swamp. Specifically, that America's representatives were using their authority to siphon the people's wealth into their own pockets. And the National Bank played favorites, ensuring the powerful remained firmly entrenched. He was also concerned by the deep state, as he believed that bureaucrats marched to their own tune, ignoring the notes the president sought to conduct. The president's status as the champion of the common man was on full display at his inauguration. He represented a cultural reckoning. For the first time, the presidency belonged not to an aristocrat or a patrician, but to a man of the frontier. His swearing in was more than a ceremony, it was a populous spectacle. Margaret Bayer Smith, a Washington socialite, described the crowd as a living, breathing mass of farmers, mechanics, frontiersmen, women, and children, all desperate for a glimpse of their new champion. After Jackson took the oath, cannons roared, people wept, and the overwhelmed president was nearly crushed as his admirers surged towards him. The real chaos erupted at the White House. Thomas Jefferson had begun a tradition of inviting the president's supporters to the People's House after the ceremony. With no crowd control or planning, the reception devolved into frenzy. Punch bowls were drained into buckets, cut glass dishes were smashed, and guests climbed through windows, staggering out with bloody noses. To alleviate the chaos, whiskey was poured into bathtubs and left on the White House lawn, allowing Jackson to slip out a back door and flee to a nearby hotel. As Smith put it, the majesty of the people quickly gave way to a full-blown mob. Perhaps that was the point. Jackson's rise and his raucous reception announced a new era. It wasn't about decorum anymore. It was about power, and who now held it. King Mob had arrived. South Carolina's John C. Calhoun was sworn in as vice president, marking his second consecutive term, as he had previously served as John Quincy Adams' second-in-command. Meacham reveals that although Calhoun had balanced the Jackson ticket, The two men were not close and never would be. To Jackson, Calhoun brought a certain polish to the administration. To Calhoun, Jackson was, God willing, a one-term president whom he would soon succeed. As they walked from the chamber to the east portico on the day of Calhoun's swearing in, they were already on different ideological and political paths. Calhoun's divergent positions weren't just about furthering his own ambitions. They aligned with the priorities of his beloved state of South Carolina. Henry Clay's American system, which President Adams had faithfully initiated, called for massive transportation expansion funded in part by high tariffs on foreign goods. Tariffs were a cornerstone of U.S. economic policy in the 1800s. Since Britain industrialized first, its goods were cheaper, giving them a major edge. To protect American factories, especially in the Northeast, Congress passed tariffs that raised the cost of imports. For manufacturers and workers up north, it was a win. The 1824 tariff helped jumpstart industries and promised good jobs. But in the South, where agriculture still ruled, tariffs just meant higher prices on everything they bought, without any of the benefits. To them, it wasn't protection, it was punishment. They called it the Tariff of Abominations, a sign they believed that the federal government was siding against them, exactly the kind of tyranny Jefferson had warned them about. Calhoun, like many wealthy Southern aristocrats, eventually linked every issue back to slavery. Although compromise had temporarily protected the peculiar institution, it was already clear that the North was moving towards abolition. Meacham reveals the VP's thinking, writing that if the national government could tax the South against its will, the national government could, in the future, take the region's slaves away against its will. Calhoun didn't think President Jackson would be the one to do that. After all, Jackson had arrived in Washington in a carriage driven by one of his slaves. He had another slave sleep at the foot of his bed while serving in the White House, just in case an incident in the middle of the night required his services. For Calhoun, Jackson was an opportunity to future-proof the South's position. The key in his mind was via an ugly and controversial process known as nullification. In protest of John Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts, Thomas Jefferson, who at the time had just finished serving as Adams' vice president, authored and published the Kentucky Resolutions. Resolutions differ from bills in that they merely express the desire or viewpoint of Congress, rather than creating enforceable law. By passing the resolutions, Kentucky declared that the Constitution was a mere compact among the states. Because it was something that states had agreed to, they retained the right to nullify any unconstitutional laws within their borders. Under this interpretation, Kentucky could unilaterally prevent the enforcement of the Alien Act within its borders. President Adams chose not to respond publicly, hoping to starve the resolution of attention. Enforcement of the Alien and Sedition Acts continued, one of which ironically is still used today in immigration enforcement. But the controversy became a key issue in the 1800 election. Jefferson won, and once in office, pardoned all 10 individuals convicted under the Sedition Act. Now, 30 years later, the states' rights doctrine was being revived by another vice president working against the will of his governing partner. This version was more muscular, employing assertive language to argue that states had the power to nullify and resist the enforcement of federal laws. Worse, it carried the thinly veiled threat that a state might secede from the Union if the federal government continued to enforce a law the state had nullified. Full disclosure, I think the nullification doctrine is absurd, a willfully ignorant misreading of history. At the time it was proposed, several founding fathers were still very much alive and paying attention. James Madison, co-author of the Federalist Papers and architect of Virginia's response to the Kentucky resolutions, flat out declared that Calhoun's theory was unconstitutional and unworkable. America had already tested the idea of giving states veto power over the federal government. It was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was a disaster. The Constitution was the solution to that mess. Calhoun's spin that a state could block a federal law unless the Constitution was amended to force compliance would turn governing into a constitutional editing war. It was a recipe for chaos, constant amendments, endless gridlock, and a federal government paralyzed by every state-level tantrum. The vice president's master plan was a slow-moving one. First, he expected to convince Jackson to abolish the Tariff of Abominations. Next, he would ensure that Jackson failed on the job, resulting in the president stepping back from Washington and Calhoun emerging as the leading Southern candidate against Henry Clay. Once president, Calhoun would cement the nullification doctrine as settled U.S. law, future-proofing the institution of slavery against any Northern challenges. But Jackson wasn't a pushover. A staunch Unionist, despite being a Southern slaveholder, he refused to back Calhoun, suggesting in his first inaugural address that the tariff needed reform rather than outright repeal. Privately, he was sympathetic to lowering tariffs, but he hated disunion talk even more. Soon, the two men's relationship devolved to such a degree that Jackson would later claim one of his two regrets in life was not hanging his vice president. One of my all-time favorite phrases is that the answer to 99 out of 100 questions is money. In my experience, the one remaining answer more often than not is women. As Jackson settled into the role of president, he was forced to confront what became known as the Petticoat Affair, a drama that, in my opinion, deserves no more attention than the so-called scandal that was President Obama's tan suit. Meacham's American Lion, our main source for this series, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning deep dive into Jackson's presidency. But I was genuinely surprised by how much of it reads like an episode of The Real Housewives of D.C. The drama centered on John Eaton, Jackson's Secretary of War and longtime friend who married Peggy O'Neill, a bold, charismatic innkeeper's daughter with a scandalous reputation. Peggy had grown up in D.C., playing piano and staying up late, charming senators at her father's boarding house. In her own words, she was turning men's heads before she was out of pigtails. She'd eloped twice before marrying a Navy sailor, whose debts were conveniently cleared by a bill sponsored by none other than Senator John Eaton. When that husband died of pneumonia, Peggy waited just 8 months, an eyebrow-raisingly short mourning period, before marrying Eaton. The timing raised suspicions. Whispers spread that she'd been pregnant, or worse, that she'd been cheating. And the rumors didn't stop there. Depending upon which parlor you stepped in, Peggy was either a flirt, a gold digger, a kept woman, or the madame of a brothel masquerading as a boarding house. The scandal exploded for 2 reasons. First, the vice president's wife refused to invite the Eatons over for a social call. In today's terms, it was like being blocked on every social media platform, untagged in every photo, and then watching the VP's wife throw a high society rager while live streaming your absence. Just like a modern cancellation spiral, the fallout spread fast, from whispered gossip to cabinet infighting. Soon, no one would receive the Eatons except President Jackson himself, who shut down the rumors with a thunderous declaration that she is as chaste as a virgin. And privately, Jackson was even more blunt. When later asked his opinion of the Petticoat Affair, he snapped, I would rather have live vermin on my back than the tongue of one of these Washington women on my reputation. But this wasn't just politics, it was personal. Jackson saw attacks on Peggy Eaton as a cruel repeat of the slander that had haunted his late wife Rachel. He blamed that campaign season cruelty for his wife's death, one which he was still grieving. So when Washington's elite turned their backs on the Eatons, Jackson didn't just see social snobbery. He saw betrayal, bullying, and history repeating itself. To make matters worse, the two people Jackson trusted most to manage his Washington household, his niece and nephew, also got swept up in the drama. They weren't sure whether to dine with Peggy, who might, depending on the rumor, be running a brothel, or if they should side with the rest of the capital's high society hostesses. In the end, they chose the comfort of the familiar clique. They sat with the mean girls. It was a betrayal that eventually resulted in their exile from D.C. And since the scandal had begun with the Calhouns, the president perceived it as an effort to weaken him for their own gain. Meacham lends credibility to this notion, writing that the states' rights elements in South Carolina believed Eaton unreliable on the tariff, and by extension, an almost certain enemy of nullification. And because of these fears, they were concerned about his influence over Jackson. Likewise, however, the Eaton affair was an opportunity to show support for the president. That was the route Martin Van Buren took, becoming the lone cabinet member to regularly entertain Peggy and John. As he struggled to reform the social circles of D.C., Jackson quickly turned his attention to remaking the bureaucracy. Previous presidents had handed out jobs to friends and allies, but Andrew Jackson turned it into a governing philosophy. Echoing his belief that Washington only worked for insiders at the expense of the common man, Old Hickory argued that government posts should rotate regularly so that ordinary citizens, not just the entrenched elites, could participate. His team called it rotation in office. Critics called it the spoils system, as in, to the victor go the spoils. By the end of his second term, Jackson had replaced 919 employees, roughly 10% of everyone the executive branch oversaw. By contrast, John Adams had only removed 9 of his predecessors' appointments, while Jefferson had held the previous record by firing 39 bureaucrats. The danger of a spoils system is that incompetent people end up in critically important roles, something I was reminded of while writing this script. Specifically, the moment that I learned that America's new health secretary just fired 100% of his nonpartisan vaccine panel, and that our director of FEMA hadn't known that there were, quote, hurricane seasons. Rather than a separate policy, the remaking of the federal bureaucracy was in line with everything else that Jackson did. Meacham explains that Jackson's vision was elementary, yet expansive in the context of the early republic. He wanted a political culture in which a majority of the voters chose a president, and a president chose his administration, and his administration governed by its lights in full view of the people, and the people decided 4 years hence whether to reward the president with another term, or retire him, and them from public life. Andrew Jackson was rapidly turning the presidency into what John F. Kennedy later called the vital center of action. If Washington stayed loyal, Jackson could eliminate the internal resistance blocking his agenda. The Petticoat affair and Calhoun's nullification schemes were distractions he had to respond to. But when it came to Indian policy, Jackson was ready to impose his will on the entire nation. Jackson raised the ugly issue of Georgia and its natives just 20 days into his first term. Eli Whitney's cotton gin had changed everything. 7 years after its introduction, American cotton exports hit 18 million pounds. And by the next decade, that number had exploded to 90 million. Cotton immediately became the engine of the national economy. Southern plantations fed northern textile mills, which then shipped finished goods around the world. A few decades later, Southerners would boast, "You dare not make war on cotton." The country bowed to King Cotton. Jackson saw only one obstacle to its throne: native nations. And unlike the planters who feared conflict, Jackson had no hesitation when it came to waging war against them. He had built his military career on early victories over the Creek Indians. Northern expansion into the Midwest had fueled America's industrial rise, but it came at the cost of hundreds of tribal homelands. Now, as president, Andrew Jackson saw an opportunity to deliver the same benefit to the South. John Quincy Adams had tried to hold the line. As president, he honored federal treaties with the Cherokee Nation, even as Georgia pushed relentlessly to break them. But the state wasn't waiting for permission. Georgia declared all native laws null and void, shut down tribal courts, banned Cherokee council meetings, and began preparing a land lottery to hand indigenous territory to white settlers. To Georgia's governor, treaties weren't sacred. They were leverage, a tactic, a way to coax, as he put it, ignorant, intractable, and savage people into surrendering land that he believed rightfully belonged to civilized men, thanks to God's command to subdue the earth. And here's the painful irony. The Cherokee had done everything the United States had asked of them. They adopted a written language, ratified a constitution, ran farms and plantations. They owned enslaved people, converted to Christianity. They even published a bilingual newspaper. Along with the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, they checked every box of civilized, at least by the standards of white America. Still, Georgia refused to listen. And neither, as the nation would soon discover, did Andrew Jackson. In his first outreach to the Cherokee, a nation that had twice saved his life during the Creek Wars, Jackson urged them to pack up and move west. He assured them they'd be happier far from white settlers. He promised that if they crossed the Mississippi, your white brothers will not trouble you. They will have no claim to your land. You and all your children can live there as long as the grass grows or the water runs. It was a poetic promise, and it was also built on a lie. As the Indian Removal Act hit Congress in 1830, the debate turned bitterly partisan. Henry Clay, never one to shrink from a fight, used his platform as Speaker of the House to rally the opposition. He and his allies launched a blistering moral offensive, publishing 24 essays that called the policy not just unjust, but outright sinful. If you claimed to be a Christian, they argued, you couldn't support forced removal and still claim a pew on Sunday. Jackson, of course, had no problem living in contradiction. Privately devout, he publicly refused to mix religion with the presidency. Not even a national cholera epidemic could convince him to endorse a day of public prayer. That kind of contradiction was classic Jackson. Wield federal power when it suited him, rail against it when it didn't. Just look at the last days of May 1830. Jackson vetoed the Maysville Road Bill, an infrastructure project in Clay's own Kentucky, on the grounds that it was a local matter beyond federal authority. The very next day, he rammed through the Indian Removal Act, asserting the federal government's right to override state laws, federal treaties, and native sovereignty in the name of national interest. To Jackson, the Constitution wasn't a rule book, it was a toolkit. Sometimes a hammer, sometimes a chisel, used to beat states into submission or carve away native land, depending upon what the job required. And since he didn't need Clay's votes to get removal passed, he made sure Clay's faction got nothing in return. Andrew Jackson was the first elected president to wield the veto as a weapon of political power, not just a constitutional check. Before him, every president combined had vetoed 9 bills. Jackson alone vetoed 12. It marked a seismic shift in presidential authority. As John Meacham puts it, Jackson saw himself as the embodiment of the people standing against entrenched interests, and believed that a mandate from the ballot box gave him the right to shape legislation directly. He didn't wait for bills to land on his desk. He expected Congress to consult him before anything made it down Pennsylvania Avenue. In 1830, that was radical. The founders had designed Congress, the Article 1 branch, to be supreme. Jackson flipped the script. And just to make sure foreign governments got the memo, he instructed them to stop addressing their correspondence to the President and Congress of the United States. From now on, he said, make it simple. Write, Dear President. These shots across the bow emboldened the opposition and fed the growing narrative of King Andrew I, the frontier general turned would-be monarch. And yet, despite the fury swirling around him, the Indian Removal Act passed by a margin of just 4 votes. The Cherokees sued in federal court to stop their removal. Other tribes, realizing the clock was ticking, began negotiating directly with the president. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek traded 5 million Choctaw acres in Mississippi for 13 million acres west of Arkansas. It's one thing to know that our government stole native lands. That's horrific enough. But it crosses into something darker, something closer to evil, when the government uproots entire nations without even planning for their survival. Removal wasn't just injustice, it was engineered catastrophe. Alexis de Tocqueville witnessed the catastrophe firsthand. Watching the Choctaws cross the Mississippi, he wrote, "It was then in the depths of winter, and that year the cold was exceptionally severe. The snow was hard on the ground, and huge masses of ice drifted on the river. The Indians brought their families with them. There were among them the wounded, the sick newborn babies, the old men on the point of death. They had neither tents nor wagons, but only some provisions and weapons. I saw them embark to cross the great river, and the sight will never fade from my memory. Neither sob nor complaint rose from that silent assembly. Their afflictions were of long standing, and they felt them to be irredeemable." The Choctaw removal was a humanitarian crisis. Cold, hunger, death, all inflicted by policy. And it was only the beginning. The Cherokees refused to yield. They went to court, challenging Georgia's blatant violations of federal treaties. 2 of their cases reached the Supreme Court. The first, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, argued that the state had no right to impose its laws on a sovereign native nation. On the facts alone, the tribe should have won. Existing treaties were federal law. The argument was airtight, but the outcome depended on one man, Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall was a giant. Appointed by John Adams, he shaped the Supreme Court more than any justice before, or arguably since. Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland, he wrote the decisions that defined federal supremacy and judicial power. Marshall was not a man who dodged conflict, until suddenly he did. In a decision that shocked even some of his allies, Marshall dismissed the case on a technicality. The Cherokee, he said, had filed as a foreign nation. In Marshall's view, they were instead a domestic dependent nation. Therefore, he claimed the court had no jurisdiction. The opinion was a masterclass in hedging. Marshall acknowledged that the United States owed Native peoples a duty of protection, but he stopped short of enforcing treaty rights or halting Georgia's assault on Cherokee sovereignty. Instead, he pointed towards another case already in the pipeline, Worcester v. Georgia, hinting that that lawsuit would be the proper place to settle the question once and for all. The stakes for the Cherokee could not have been higher. Internal distractions boiled over as the administration waited for the Worcester decision, and at the center of the storm was, surprise, John C. Calhoun. Although he never signed his name to it, Calhoun authored a manifesto titled Exposition and Protest. Even without an official signature, everyone knew who wrote it, and the message was unmistakable. This wasn't a policy paper. It was a firebomb tossed directly at federal authority. At its core was the same doctrine we discussed earlier, a state's supposed right to nullify federal law. But this version went even further. Calhoun argued that states weren't merely allowed to resist federal laws, they were morally obligated to do so when they believed those laws violated the Constitution. To a staunch Unionist like Jackson, this wasn't political theory, it was treason dressed up as legal philosophy. And Jackson immediately suspected that his vice president, his own number 2, was the head of the snake. The split between them had already burst into public view a year earlier at a Democratic dinner. Jackson had waited patiently all evening to deliver the final toast. When his moment arrived, he rose slowly, lifted his glass, and thundered, "Our Union, it must be preserved." The room froze. Everyone understood the target of the remark. But Calhoun didn't flinch. Instead, he stood, raised his own glass, and fired back with a toast that made the tension unmistakable. To the Union, next to our liberty the most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefits and burdens of the Union. Martin Van Buren, who noticed everything, later whispered to allies that the veil was rent. The polite faction of unity was gone, sides had been drawn, and as the election of 1832 approached, Washington insiders could see the truth. Calhoun wasn't preparing to serve Jackson. He was planning to depose him. He was building a new political faction, one with nullification as its beating heart. Calhoun wasn't delusional. He knew he couldn't win the presidency outright. His support was regional, confined almost entirely to the South. But he didn't need a national coalition. With Henry Clay already gearing up for a rematch and Jackson leaning towards a second term, Calhoun saw another path. Fracture the vote just enough to shove the election back into the House of Representatives. There, he believed, he'd be the safe compromise option, the man every faction could tolerate while Jackson and Clay tried to politically incinerate each other. So with Calhoun's blessing, South Carolina elected a pro-nullification governor and stacked its legislature with supporters preparing to carry out his state's rights crusade. Jackson, meanwhile, having announced his re-election bid, froze Calhoun out completely. But Calhoun was one of the great insiders in American political history, and that meant Jackson couldn't escape him. 3 members of the president's own cabinet were still deeply loyal to the vice president. Every meeting left Jackson wondering, am I hearing their best advice, or am I hearing Calhoun's poison whispered through friendly mouths? Jackson put nothing past his adversary. To friends he confided, a man who could secretly make the attempt to destroy me, and that under the strongest professions of friendship is base enough to do anything. For a man who prized loyalty above almost everything, this was a nightmare. Jackson found himself momentarily adrift, unable to trust the people sitting at his own table. The solution came, as it often did, from Martin Van Buren. The New Yorker had steadily become Jackson's closest ally, and he understood something crucial. The only way to purge Calhoun's influence was to burn down the entire cabinet. His plan was audacious. First, he and Secretary of War John Eaton, the two men Jackson trusted most, would resign voluntarily, signaling that the administration was in crisis. Calhoun, thinking Jackson was teetering on the edge, would push him the rest of the way by urging his loyalists in the cabinet to resign as well. The visual would be devastating. Secretaries fleeing the sinking ship, a president isolated, humiliated, wounded. Calhoun believed it would force Jackson to bow out of the 1832 race, leaving the field clear for himself to sweep the South. Van Buren, however, understood something Calhoun did not. Sometimes you let your enemy load the gun because you want to control where it fires. It took some convincing, but Jackson ultimately agreed to Van Buren's gambit. At the next cabinet meeting, the New Yorker made the first move, calmly offering his resignation. That single act gave Jackson the cover he needed. If his most loyal advisor was stepping aside for the good of the administration, then the others had no argument when Jackson turned to them and asked for their resignations as well. Eaton followed suit. Then, one by one, the cabinet collapsed, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a series of polite, faintly embarrassed exits. It was Washington's version of a magic trick, a slow vanish performed in plain sight. And for pulling it off, Martin Van Buren earned the nickname the Little Magician. With the purge complete, Jackson could finally rebuild. A year before the election, he began assembling a new inner circle. Van Buren was offered a diplomatic golden parachute, minister to Great Britain, as a thank you for orchestrating the reset. But Calhoun, still legally vice president, swooped in to twist the knife. Appearing in Washington specifically for the vote, he cast the Senate tiebreaker against Van Buren's appointment. It was a public humiliation, and a flashing neon sign that the president and vice president were now operating on opposite sides of the chessboard. But Calhoun's sabotage backfired. By blocking Van Buren's posting overseas, Jackson kept him close enough to serve in the unofficial but highly influential kitchen cabinet. Jackson later rewarded him by placing him on the presidential ticket, exactly where Calhoun hadn't wanted him. Jackson's reconstructed cabinet now held two key new figures. Lewis Cass, the new Secretary of War, was a hardliner on Indian removal and would later oversee the Trail of Tears. And Roger Taney, elevated to Attorney General, beginning the ascent that would end on his most infamous tenure as Chief Justice, authoring Dred Scott v. Stanford, one of the darkest rulings in Supreme Court history. Meanwhile, the kitchen cabinet, packed with loyalists, editors, and newspapermen, became Jackson's shadow government. They shaped policy, but more importantly, they shaped public perception. It was their coordinated messaging that reframed Indian removal not as a humanitarian catastrophe, but as a defensive necessity against dangerous intruders. When South Carolina pushed nullification to the brink of civil war, they painted Jackson as a fearless patriot defending the Union from radical traitors. From the outside, however, the administration looked like a circus. John Quincy Adams, now serving as a representative in the House, watched the cabinet implosion with academic disbelief. He wrote to his son, saying, "People stare and laugh and say, 'What next?'" To Adams, Jackson appeared overwhelmed, flailing, embarrassingly outmatched by the job. One Pennsylvania congressman fumed, "His administration is absolutely odious, and yet there is an adherence to the man. It remains to be seen whether this will not yield to the conviction that his continuance must be destructive of everything that is worthy to be cherished. Washington insiders saw chaos, but voters still saw a champion. They believed Jackson was cleaning house, not losing control. They saw resolve, not weakness. And they trusted him, not the same elites who had schemed against him in 1824. Some in Congress whispered about impeachment, but even Henry Clay knew it was empty talk. The Senate was divided 50-50 between North and South. There was no path to conviction. And Clay, ever the strategist, understood something crucial. A failed impeachment would only turn Jackson into a martyr of the common man. And the last thing Henry Clay wanted was to give Andrew Jackson another enemy to swing at on the campaign trail. Calhoun's fate was sealed by forces far beyond his control. Instead of rallying the nation around his theory of nullification, he watched his support evaporate, even among men who once respected him. Adams, one of the sharpest constitutional minds in the country, read Calhoun's exposition with growing horror. When he finished, he didn't mince words, stating, "I have been deeply disappointed in him and now expect nothing from him but evil." As if the universe agreed with that assessment, calamity struck Calhoun's personal life. His wife suffered a miscarriage, and torrential rains wiped out much of his annual crop. His political fortunes were collapsing, and now his own household seemed to follow suit. Worse still was what happened next, not to Calhoun, but to the Cherokee Nation. Two Christian missionaries, Samuel Worcester and Elihu Butler, were arrested under a new Georgia law that made it illegal for white men to live on Cherokee land without a state-issued permit. Everyone knew what Georgia was doing, trying to force a constitutional crisis that would break Cherokee sovereignty once and for all. This time, however, the Cherokee Nation filed everything correctly. Their case went straight to the martial court. As the justices deliberated, Jackson received an unexpected political gift from hundreds of miles away. In Illinois, the Black Hawk Band of the Sauk Nation crossed back into their ancestral hunting ground near the Mississippi River, territory they had been forced to abandon under a disputed removal agreement. Local militia arrived drunk, panicked, and aggressive. The parley collapsed into violence, leaving 12 men from Illinois dead and triggering widespread fear of a native uprising. It was exactly the narrative Jackson had been pushing. In speeches, he made the case brutally clear, stating that no sensible person would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages over a union occupied by more than 12 million happy people and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. That sentiment, raw, racist, and politically effective, set the stage for what came next. When Chief Justice John Marshall finally issued his ruling in Worcester v. Georgia, it was a thunderbolt. The court affirmed Cherokee sovereignty. It declared Georgia's laws unconstitutional. In theory, it should have stopped removal cold in its tracks. But Jackson had spent years priming the nation to fear native resistance. So when the ruling arrived, he simply ignored it. He had the public behind him. He had states' rights advocates behind him. And most critically, he had the army. Whether he actually said the famous line, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it," doesn't matter. What matters is that he acted exactly as if he had said it. The Supreme Court had spoken. Andrew Jackson just refused to listen. Historian Alan Taylor explains why Jackson's decision to ignore the Supreme Court wasn't just tolerated by white Southerners, it was cheered on by them. Native nations still held a tenth of Georgia, a sixth of Alabama, and fully half of Florida and Mississippi. As indigenous farmers improved their land, those tracts became even more irresistible to white planters hungry for cotton profits. And even though native nations practiced slavery themselves, Southern whites feared any autonomous native community inside their borders. To them, it looked like an open invitation for enslaved people to run away, or worse, to rebel. One Georgia newspaper made the paranoia explicit, warning that if our savage neighbors may be allowed to abide in our bosom, our slaves may be filched from us. That sentiment helps explain why Jackson paid no political price for blowing past the court's ruling in Worcester v. Georgia. There's a twist to this story. Jackson didn't technically defy the court, not yet. He benefited from a legal wrinkle and some very convenient timing. Meacham explains that under Section 25 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, the Supreme Court could not issue a final enforceable judgment until the case had been remanded to a lower court, and that lower court refused to comply. Only then would the Supreme Court's decision require enforcement. So when the justices issued their opinion in Worcester, it had to be sent back down to the Superior Court of Georgia, a body that everyone knew would ignore it. But the moment that happened, the moment Georgia predictably refused, the Supreme Court had already adjourned for the year. Nothing else could legally move forward until the justices reconvened in January of 1833. In the strictest sense of the law, Jackson was powerless to act, or be forced to act, for nearly 10 months. And Jackson used that time exactly as he wanted to. By the time the court was back in session and theoretically able to challenge the administration, the machinery of removal was already in motion. The Trail of Tears had begun, and the voters? They rewarded Jackson with a second term for it. Which is where we turn next, as the subsequent episode will begin with the devastation wrought upon the Cherokee people by an administration that was more concerned with speed than care. We will also examine the president's re-election in 1832, his bank war, and the other changes that Jacksonian democracy brought to America. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.